Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Poema podcast. I am James Prescott, your host. Welcome to the show. Really great to have you all with us again. It's always great to be with you. And today, a friend of mine is returning to the show, Nikki Pappas, who was on a while back talking about her podcast and sharing her story. Has now got a book out, and it's very exciting. And we're going to talk about that today. So welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so great to be back with you.
Yes, it is, and I've been on your podcast since you were on mine as well. So it's we've chatted a lot since last time, anyway. I'm glad you're here, and your book is called "As Familiar as Family."
Yes.
And it's about leaving toxic religion, and it's your story. Um, I've managed to read a fair bit of it, and I love it. And the chapter titles are very, very clever. I've never seen anything like it with chapter title, with section titles rather than chapters. I think it's not chapter titles, is it? It's can I give that away?
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay, well, there's like 6 sections, right? And the first section is called I. The second section is called Lived For. The third section is called The Approval Of. The fourth section is called Someone Else. Section 5 is called And Lost. And section 6 is called Myself. Now, I'm sure that most of you can put those words together. So, I lived for the approval of someone else and lost myself. And I just love that because it's so imaginative but also so accurate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
A lot of people on the same story, so tell us about this book and where it kind of came from.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I read a book, I think it was in the Memoir Project by Marion Roach, and she
Oh yeah,
talked about how the argument of a book, like each book is making an argument. And so she said, if you can write down your argument, you can get your structure for your book. And so that is the genesis of what became the section titles, was because I decided my argument, the thing I would be driving for in my storytelling, would be to illustrate how I lost myself by living for the approval of someone else. And so I then started the book with I kind of gave the reader some background information about myself. And then along the storyline, you see how I started at a church and how initially I was welcomed into that church and it felt like family to me, but safer in a way because of I could now see how toxic my family relationships were. And I thought that the church relationships, because they were not emotionally and physically violent or abusive in calling me names and things like that, it just felt healthier, right? And over the course of my time there, I really lived for the approval of the pastor there. And eventually, I lost myself, became a shell of who I was at the church, and that led to spiritual abuse. And then in the book, the last section is myself. And so it's coming out of that toxic environment, the losing of all of that relationship and all the friends there, or not all of them, but a good chunk of people from that church, and the relationship with the pastor, losing all of that, but ending the story on myself. So I started with I, right? Section 1I, and then come back to myself and end with where I am on my journey and finding who I am, embracing who I am, and living into that.
I love that.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's so good. Yeah. See, I've read the I bit. I haven't read the myself bit yet. I'm still working my way through the book, so that's going to be exciting to get to. But that's it. That's the arc, isn't it? I guess that's the journey.
Yeah.
And it's kind of an ongoing journey. It's not like you get to yourself and then you're finished, because we're never finished, are we? Right? We're always growing and learning and unlearning and everything and finding out more of us, finding more of ourselves. So, yeah. I'm sure that people find that find that story familiar as well. Like that, that that you can easily when you get sucked into kind of religious certainty or toxic religion, that's kind of what it does, isn't it? You lose yourself, you lose your own identity because your
Mhm.
identity is in Christ, in inverted commas, and so you have to kind of lose your identity, and that's
Mhm.
like, and they kind of make that sound like a virtue rather than something that's not good. Yeah, it's amazing. I'm actually realizing, and I fell for this as well. So, it's so many people's story. How did that happen for you?
Yeah. So I opened the book. The intro is an interaction with the pastor where I'm being directly spiritually abused. It's kind of the story that would be the impetus for me eventually leaving the church, right? But right after that intro, I flash back. Chapter 1 starts with how I met the pastor. And so I end up at this church because of who this pastor presented himself to be, and how throughout my life I've been searching for belonging. I want to feel like I belong. I want to feel like I am wanted in a space, that I'm needed there, and that I'm loved by the people there. And so when I met this pastor and his wife on a weekend retreat for college students, because I was in college at the time, he was getting ready to plant his own church, to start his own church. And so I met him that weekend. We kind of bonded over this silly thing where I was doing a zip line, and I do not like heights, but I did it anyway. And then I was screaming my head off and about to cry. And he thought it was funny, but not in a like, I didn't feel like he was laughing at me in a mean way. I felt like, oh, I'm making him laugh. And so it made me feel kind of special, the way that I was like, oh, I stand out in a way, right? He's going to remember me in this moment that we've met. Like, oh, that's cool, because he didn't really talk to a lot of people, but he was talking to me. And so there was this way of feeling valued and feeling special. And I am extroverted. So once the church started and I started attending the church, it became very apparent that my extrovertedness was needed for getting people in the doors and keeping them at the church. And so my extrovertedness kind of served as a valuable asset to the church. And so from the pulpit, the preacher would just praise the extroverts of the church and just talk about how much we were needed, and how he really struggles with small talk, but we're so great at, you know, getting in there, talking to people. And so then I felt like, oh, I am wanted here. I'm needed here. And I think that that is such a powerful driving force, to feel wanted, to feel needed, and to feel valuable. And that's how I felt at the beginning at the church.
Mm, yeah, it is very powerful. I Yeah, it's amazing actually that when you stand away from it, just you realize what it was and what was being done to you, and like how obvious it looks from the outside, but yeah, um, just being so convinced that you have to be part of this thing and that you have to give yourself to wholly and fully to this thing, and that
Mhm.
it's normal and that that's what life is, and that's your identity, and that things like your desires are bad. This kind of whole reverse. I mean, the whole reverse thing of like, if it's something that you want to do, then God doesn't want you to do it, right?
Mhm.
Like, which like when you're in that space, it's like, oh, that sounds right, because it's all about self-sacrifice, right? But when you're out of it, it's like that makes no sense whatsoever. Like, even if you're still believing in God, why would God give people desires not to use them? right? If my desire is to make things, to create things that help people, why would a good, loving, divine being not want me to do that? Right?
Mhm.
Um, if I desire a partner, why would somebody want to stop me from doing that? Now obviously there's healthy desires and unhealthy desires, but that's a whole different thing. Like,
Mhm.
yeah, it's just bizarre. And but you get sucked into it so easily, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I would say that early on, one of the earliest memories I have of this misbelief taking root in me of thinking my body is not my own, right? And so that was when I was sexually abused as a child,
Hmm.
and connecting that in my book to the spiritual abuse that went on to happen, because when as a child I have this misbelief that my body is not my own and that what I want doesn't matter, that the people in power know better than I do, the people with authority over me know better than I do, and I just need to submit to them. When you take all of that baggage from my childhood and misbeliefs from my childhood, and then come into a high control religious situation where a whole theology is put to this, where I'm literally being told, like, you are not your own, right? You were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body, from First Corinthians, something like that, right? And when I'm being told that it's all about you're part of a family now, and in a family, we were told at this church, when you're part of a family, you have to do things you don't want to do. So it's all this messaging of, for the good of the church, you have to just do things you don't want to do. And again, these are messages that someone who, like, no one really needs to hear those messages. Maybe the people who hold power need to hear the message that, like, hey, you're part of something bigger here. Your preferences should take the back seat because you have the power and people will default to you. So let's move away from you having the power. But for the people who are disempowered, for the people who feel they don't have a voice, for the people who've been abused and traumatized, the message we do not need is, you are not your own, right? And that was the message over and over again at the church I was a part of. You are not your own. You were bought with a price. And so, again, just connecting the wounds of my childhood with what I went on to experience in a different way, but at the root of it was still the same power dynamics and control and abuse, though it looked different from the outside, because the church context just had this Christian veneer to it. And like you said, all these things that are painted as if it's virtuous, that you would die to yourself and that you would do all these things, when it's like, it's not virtuous if it's coming from this place of, well, I can't speak up because I don't want to be excommunicated.
Yeah, and yeah, exactly. Like, if you're, I mean, that's just like one of the biggest red flags going, isn't it? If you are afraid to speak your mind because you're afraid that you'll be excluded for any reason or in any way, that's like, get out of there. Like, just get
Mhm,
out of there right now. Right? That's
mhm,
not a safe place to be. Um, Especially for a woman in a place where male power dynamics are very strong, right? Which is
mhm,
in American evangelical churches. That's it. The power dynamic is with white men,
mhm,
and so that makes it a much less safe place for a woman
mhm,
or female body at birth. Um, and so yeah, it's very dangerous because, like, if they're making people blindly believe stuff and do stuff out of blind, almost cult-like belief, then you can just then it becomes easy for them to justify abuse or disguise it as something else.
mhm.
Any kind of abuse, spiritual abuse, or any other kind of abuse. I mean, well, literally seen it. Like, there's so many cases of it coming out now, and it's terrifying, really, when you think about how easy it was for people to persuade people to to kind of fall into this trap.
Mhm. Yes, and I think at the core of it, at least in my own experience, is coming back to that idea of belonging. And what I end up
Mm.
writing about in my book is that by the end, I realized the key to belonging was in me all along, right? I was searching for it outside of myself. I was searching for it in people who, to go back to what you were saying, if you have to basically adhere to this certain set of beliefs and all these things to belong, then it's not true belonging. If you have to shed parts of yourself and your own identity in order to be accepted, it's not true belonging. And it just was a long journey for me to realize that, and for me to be able to step back and to realize the key to belonging is in me. I don't have to look for it outside of myself.
That's right. It's already in you.
Mhm.
That was going to be my next point. Like, was there any? At what point did you kind of start to intuitively realize that you were somebody else,
Mm.
and that you needed to find that person away from what they were telling you had to be?
Yeah. It would probably be when I discovered the Enneagram was
Oh wow.
the first, I think, nugget that I can really point to of realizing I tested as a type 2, but then as I read about it, and the 2, for anyone who doesn't know, is the helper, and as the more I read about it, the more I was like, "I don't think this is who I am." And so I read about some of the other types and I realized, "Oh, I'm a 3. I'm a type 3." More than that, I now realize I'm a sexual dominant type 3. And what the sexual dominant types do is merge with the people around them. And then the 3 is characterized as a chameleon at times, able to adapt to the environment that they're in. And so as I realized, oh, I exchanged the things I wanted in order to bond with this pastor. I exchanged the things I wanted to pursue in my life to help this pastor build his church. And I had been a teacher before I had children. And then I ended up realizing so much of the messaging around me was being explicitly told that being a wife and a mom being a mom was the highest and holiest calling. And so when I realized, as I read about the Enneagram and realized I was a type 3 and saw how I had decided that, oh, well, if this is what it is to be successful, quote unquote, successful in this environment, then this is what I'll be. And then I realized, oh, I was just making decisions based on what other people wanted for me and what other people said. Even going back to being a teacher, that was because that's what I was told I would be good at by family members and that kind of thing. I hadn't interrogated, is this what I want to do? And so, yeah, I think just learning about myself, about my desires and my motivations and why I do what I do really unlocked something for me to ask the question, well, what do I want to do? What does Nikki want? What do I want for my own life? And not just following what other people want for me.
Mm, yeah, and it only takes one little seed to be planted, really, to
Mhm.
just shift your mind and your heart and your intuition to a different thing, to kind of rip you out of that what you've been in, doesn't it? It's, I mean, like, I think for me, like, the thing that really set it off was my mother dying.
Hmm.
Like, because that's a, like, everyone knows what the trauma, how big a trauma that can be. Like, and it was such a big disruption for me. And I said this elsewhere, that the idea of God that I had and everything was just didn't work anymore. It wasn't big enough. It wasn't
Mhm.
satisfactory enough to deal with this stuff. And I had all these, after that, I had all these questions, and then I just kept asking
Mm.
questions, and that led me where I am now, probably.
Mhm.
And because it only takes one thing sometimes to just just rock the boat enough that you can see a different perspective.
Mhm.
Yeah. So how did that kind of then evolve in terms of like it's starting to kind of unravel and kind of discover yourself and kind of discover how you'd lost yourself?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good question, and there's a lot here, so I'll try to be brief, succinct, and say that I think in beginning to know myself and get to learn about myself, that opened up the possibilities to getting to know other things, right? As I was open to seeing maybe, like you said, a new perspective on myself and on other people. There was something very revolutionary with the Enneagram about being able to extend curiosity and compassion to myself and then let that flow to displaying and overflowing with curiosity and compassion to other people. And I think we might have talked about this either when we talked first time or when you were on my podcast about curiosity and compassion and internal family systems model of therapy. But even before I was like officially in therapy, I was already starting to have that curiosity and asking questions. And so it was kind of just this natural progression of as I asked questions about myself and tried to get to know myself, then I had more questions. And then I had questions about what I believed. Because if everything I'd been taught about myself, was rooted in control tactics, and then I'm learning about this personality typing kind of thing and way of understanding myself and my motivations, because theologically, if I was taught that the reason I do the bad, quote, bad things that I do is because I'm totally depraved, and now with the Enneagram, I'm getting other language that helps explain why I make the decisions that I make and do the things that I do, then it's like, oh, so maybe I'm not this horribly wicked sinner. Maybe there's this other way of understanding who I am. And so as I began to understand who I am and who I'm becoming, then I started asking questions about, we talked about this in our other conversation when it came to white supremacy and racism in the United States in the context that I'm in. There's an organization called Be the Bridge. And that organization, there was a chapter in our area. And so I joined it, started reading a lot of books and talking to people and joining groups on Facebook and all these things that were a whole new way of thinking about racism and white supremacy in particular. And so from there, again, leading with that curiosity, I was then on this journey towards understanding sexism and the patriarchy and how it's not God's good design, as I have been told. And so it was just kind of that way of one question leading me to another question. And I wasn't nervous. I wasn't afraid about asking the questions and just kind of kept going from there.
That's it. Once you're on going down the rabbit hole, that's
Uh-huh.
it. Like it is kind of a slippery slope, but in a good way.
Right.
Is that they use that? Like, often people who are trying to criticize people who leave or deconstruct are like, oh, it's a slippery slope, and I'm like, and now I'm kind of like, yeah, kinda. So,
Mhm.
and I'm happy to go down it. Um, like I don't know where exactly it's going to go, but I know that it's better than where I've been, and I know that I'm going to keep growing as a result of it, and it's going to be fun. Um, when it's all slippy and everything, and that can be fun. So, I just love how you can now kind of like almost um, reconfigure or reverse engineer these kind of things that were used against us to kind of be kind of cool things like the
Yep.
slippery slope thing. Yeah. Um, and what did that look like? That kind of process, like how challenging was it to to because there's a grieving, isn't there, of when you start to leave that stuff behind, because you lose relationships and you lose routines that you've been in, even if they were bad
Mhm.
ones. they're still familiar.
Mhm.
So like this, you lose things that are familiar, and then you have to move into something that's new and uncertain. I've definitely experienced this. Like
Mhm.
I've had times where I kind of almost wish I still had the routines that I had, or some of the certainty that I had, But and that's a normal thing. So what did that look like for you?
Yeah, well, even you bringing that up about like what was familiar, right? If there's that study, if you've heard about it, of the mice and the mice who are raised in like this chaotic environment versus the mice that are raised in this more serene environment, and how the mice who are raised in the chaotic environment, even when given the opportunity to go to this calm and serene environment, will go back to the chaotic environment. And again, it's because of what is familiar. And then for me, that looked like, even though I grew up in this, again, outwardly, and anyone who could see it, it's like abusive, toxic, familial relationships, and how I just replaced those with a religious context that was at the root some of the same issues, just looked different on the outside, or to an outside perspective. They would think, oh, well, I guess maybe someone who's in a similar situation would be like, I've said this in my book. I wrote about how the men at the church didn't call me names. The men at the church didn't do all these things. And so it's like, if it sounds like the bar was low, that's because it was, right? Like, here's what was familiar to me. So it just had to be a little bit better than that for me to feel like, oh, this is a better situation. Right. And so then once I started realizing, oh, no, it's not that different. Under the surface, there is narcissism, all this hypocrisy, a hierarchy, as well as, again, the control, the power dynamics, and the spiritual abuse. And then the big thing was emotional detachment. It's right. I realized how emotionally detached my dad was from me, and then saw that in this relationship with this pastor, emotional detachment, right? And so it's like, okay, well, that is what was familiar to me. Emotional detachment was familiar to me. But as I got to know myself and know what I want and what I need to feel safe and to feel connected, and then this pastor directly spiritually abused me, that led me on a 6-month journey of connecting with myself, again, asking more questions, and encountering the work of Rachel Held Evans, and working through a lot of those things, and then coming out on the other side of it, like deciding 6 months after being spiritually abused, having a follow up meeting finally 6 months later, and deciding my time at the church is over. Because during that 6 months, so much had changed for me personally, to where I knew what I deserved. I knew that I needed to be treated with respect, and that this wasn't respectful what he was doing, how this pastor was treating me, to where I was like, well, I can't settle for anything less than being treated well. I will not be treated like he's treating me. And so coming out of the church, yes, was very hard, losing a lot of relationships, but there were some relationships with people who had already left the church, to where I know some people, they come out of a situation and don't have a network or don't have support systems, but I did. I had people who I could confide in, talk to. So I had a support system, and that kind of helped. Well, that helped a lot in coming out of it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's important, isn't it? We all need community. We all need safe community. Um, if we're going to be healthy, like anyone who's deconstructing or whatever, leaving the church or going on this journey, whatever label you want to use, you need to find people, your people. You need to find people that are your support network,
Mhm.
and will stay with you through that journey. And because we're not meant to do this stuff on our own. We're not meant to, we're meant to be in community in some way, shape, or form. We need each other. We need solidarity. That's why it's so great that there's so many little communities growing up, kind of organically online, which are kind of people that are going through this journey, because because it means that you're not alone. It means that if you leave things behind, or leave people behind, or leave communities behind that are toxic, then you're not alone. And that's definitely been important for me. And I'm sure it's been important for you as well, right?
Yeah, for sure. Because seeing how I need to surround myself with people who cultivate the best in me and who don't expect me to change who I am in order to quote belong, like we were talking about. And so that was a part of my journey too, was realizing the only relationships worth cultivating and maintaining are the ones rooted in a mutuality rather than a hierarchy. And so having relationships with people who don't try to control me, who don't try to act like they know better for me than I know for myself. And that's been hard. And even from the book that you'll be reading, it's hard because there are some relationships in there that look different now, even though at the time of the writing of the book were how I presented them. They were good relationships, and those things changed. And my editor asked me during one of the final read throughs if there was anything I would want to change, if I would want to not have a certain relationship or some relationships be such a primary focus. And I said, no, I want to honor what these relationships were at the time that they were that thing, right? And so that's been a part of the journey too, right? Of realizing, oh, like things are constantly changing and I accept that change. But also, I don't want to look back on something and act like it didn't serve a purpose or rewrite it in a way that would diminish the purpose that something served. Because even when you look at the church that I was a part of, for a time, the church, that particular church and that pastor, in a coping mechanism type of way, helped me survive, right? Eventually that was no longer the case and I left, right? And that's okay. But I don't want to act like it wasn't beneficial for me at a time or not necessarily beneficial, but because obviously under the surface it was in the long term not beneficial, but in that moment, in a short term sort of solution, it helped me get through something, right? I outgrew it. Which I don't mean that to sound like a superiority thing, as if you're still there, you haven't outgrown it or you're not growing. But I personally was like, this doesn't work for me anymore. This isn't what I want anymore. And so coming out of that and seeing how the people who I want to surround myself with. Okay, I'll tell this quick story. I had an aunt growing up who was my favorite aunt. She taught me how to do so many things, and I get my love of mint chocolate chip ice cream from her, the green kind with thin mint shavings. And also, she just spent time with me. She would pop popcorn and put chocolate in it, and I still do that. And then I had some aunts who had a lot more money than this aunt did and who were Santa Claus for me and who bought me really nice things, right? And then I watched those aunts spend time with some of my other cousins, but not spend intentional one on one time with me. Whereas my aunt, who couldn't buy me nice things, spent time with me. And so for me personally, I have learned that practicing presence with me is what makes me feel known, right? And that's what makes me feel connected to someone. And so, for better or worse, that's how I see the world. That's how I interact in the world. That's how and especially if I've told someone, if I've communicated with someone that what I need is time together, and then that person doesn't prioritize. And I'm not saying I need to see someone every day. I'm not saying I need to see a friend every week. I'm just saying I need to know that my friendship is a priority for us to see each other in person when we can, right? And so now seeing how my aunt who practiced presence with me, it's like she wasn't perfect because none of us are, but those best qualities in her, or the qualities that made me come most alive and made me feel most valued, that's what I'm looking for in the people who I'm in community with now. Is I want it to be a reciprocal, right? Mutual, not me just taking and me just expecting to be loved the way I need to be loved, right? I want to return that love as other people need to be loved. But yeah, like just realizing how I can't make someone love me that way, and I'm not going to try to make them love me that way. And so that's different from how, like, there are relationships that I said, like, even at the end of the book that I wrote about that are different now. But I told my editor, no, that's what it was at the time. And I want to honor what it was back then, even if it's not that anymore.
I love that. That's that's real integrity as well. Like maturity as well. Like to say that relationship was good for me at that moment. It was healthy for me. It was nurturing for me. But now it's not, and
Mm-hmm.
that's okay. And moved on from that. But I'm still going to acknowledge the role that relationship played in my life.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really healthy way to approach it. I think. Like, I mean, what did the process of writing the book do for you in terms of like healing and like and moving through it and your own growth?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So in 2019 was when I started therapy. And in the end of 2019 was when I started, or no, maybe it was April 2019, I think, was when I did the first poetry month, what is it? Like, yeah, you know what I'm talking
Yeah,
about.
I know what
So
you're talking
I
about.
participated in April of 2019, and I started therapy in October 2019, maybe. And then in 2020, I started entering my writing into different competitions and all this stuff. And my therapist was like, wow. Like, she was impressed that I was putting my work out there because, again, coming out of that church and everything that happened, I was ready to move cities. I was ready to do all these things to not see certain people. And my therapist looked at me and she said, if you want to move because you want to, then do it. But if you're moving just to avoid certain people from your church context or that kind of thing, like, don't let them take that from you. Like, they've already taken so much. And there was something in that when she said that that unlocked something for me. And I started just living my life where I am instead of being so nervous to leave the house because I don't want to run into someone, right? Which I still don't want to run into certain people, but I was like, okay, I can do this. I can face this. And that's when I started really working on my writing, and I had signed up. This is funny. Like, how I signed up for yoga, I signed up to audition for a play and all this stuff. The weekend that was ready to do all of that, like, it was all going to be starting up the next week, is when COVID shut everything down here in March 2020. And so it's like I was finally getting ready to, like, take my life back and do the things in my city that I wanted to do, and then everything got shut down. So I was like, okay, cool. So we're going to convene, figure out what I can do. And that's when I really started entering my writing into competitions. And yeah, my therapist said, there's something cathartic about writing for you. And so she's the one who encouraged me, like, keep writing, not necessarily keep writing in order to enter into competitions or in order to publish a book one day, which publishing a book really wasn't even, it's like, it was a far off dream in 2020, like an idea that I would like to one day do that. Right. And so her telling me that this is what is going to help you heal, and she saw the value in it for me for my own personal healing. So that's when I started really writing. And I guess I should say the very, very, very first iterations of what would become the book that you have now been reading were like 8 years ago or something, 7 years ago. And
Wow.
obviously, it's a very different book now than it would have been had I published it
Mm,
back then. Very, very different. But there are
absolutely.
little
Yeah.
nuggets of the same story. There are pieces that were there in that very, very first draft. And then I didn't touch it because I shared it with someone from my previous church context. And she was supposed to kind of mentor me as a writer and all the stuff. She read it and then never talked to me about it. She let me know she read it, but then it never went anywhere. And so it was kind of a deflating, like, oh, well, then I guess maybe it wasn't good or that kind of thing. And so then I quit writing. So again, I started a blog at one point though, but again, it was about being a mom because of course it was, because that's what I was told I could write about. So that was when I was still at the church. And then fast forward to leaving the church, doing the writing and entering competitions, I took that very, very early draft from however long ago. I reworked it and I made it like a third person fictionalized story. And that distance really helped me to get some things out that I wanted to say about the spiritual abuse and the church stuff, but I could do it in a more detached way because it
Yeah.
wasn't me, it was like this character I created. And so I did that first. I wrote that, entered that into competitions. It didn't get picked up. And then I worked on it at the beginning of last year. I started working on it again in a new way. And that turned into this kind of revenge novel against the church and the pastor. And it was pretty angry and bitter, which I think I needed.
Yeah.
Personally, I needed to
Absolutely.
do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, but then I was like, okay, but people don't need to read this, right? This is for me. This won't help anyone move through. It's going to help me move through because it's part of my process, but it won't help someone else really get through what they're going through. And that was when at the beginning of this year, in February this year, I had beta readers read a 108-page draft of what would become the book that is now out, As Familiar's Family, which is a 350-page book. So it went from 108 pages to 350 pages because from the feedback from the writers, I realized, oh, I need to talk more about this and more about this and just adding more depth and nuance and layers and stories to illustrate that overarching argument that I was making, that I lost myself living for the approval of someone else, right?
Mm. Yeah, I always feel like I talk about this subject a lot on this show. Art always has a purpose. Like and it always has a purpose for us. Whether it has a
Mhm.
purpose for anybody else is actually secondary. It's like that second bit, the revenge novel, right? That was literally just for you. You wrote that for yourself, and for yourself, not in the sense that, not in an indulgent way, but in a kind of in a therapeutic way. There was stuff in you that you needed to get out of your body,
Yeah.
and art allows us to do that. And nobody else has to see it. It's great. Like there's when you actually like, and this is almost a different subject, but it is related. That when you free yourself from from having to make stuff for other people, you can make whatever
Mhm.
you want, and you can really enjoy it, and nobody ever has to see it, and it doesn't matter.
Mhm.
And it's
Yeah.
so like, oh gosh, it's so liberating from this kind of Christian slash evangelical slash capitalist kind of view of like art that has to have a purpose, and it has to be for people, and it has to make
Mhm.
money, and it has to help loads of people, whatever, to be valuable. And that's not true. Like all art is valuable. It all has a purpose. Even the stuff that gets thrown away, even the stuff that never gets finished, it all means something. It all does
Mhm.
something for us. Like, and for people on this journey, like, there's this kind of ongoing joke about people who deconstruct starting a podcast or writing a blog and things, and it's accurate. But I think the kind of flip side to that is the serious side to that is that the reason that happens is because this is this is how people are processing their grief and their trauma and all the stuff that they're carrying. Like, because art and creativity allows us to do that. So of course, people are going to make podcasts. They're going to write books. I'm going to write stuff themselves. They're going to write blogs that maybe nobody reads or except whatever. They're going to do that because it's a way of processing, uh,
Mhm.
and it's a way of healing. Like, um, and because as well, people are discovering things about themselves that they didn't know, and desires, and they're discovering curiosities about things. And I mean, like literally, this podcast exists because I was curious about making a podcast.
Mm.
And yeah, and like it's been healing for me. Like I don't make it to like to make money. I'm thinking because I love doing it, because I learn a lot from doing it, and I enjoy it, and the fact that it helps other people is always like a gift, like a
Mm.
bonus. You know, that's just a privilege, really, to be able to make things which help other people. But yeah, I mean, like I love that you've made all these things, and they've been part of your journey as much as like that they weren't for anybody else, really. That like this book, okay, maybe it is for other people and it's going to help other people, but ultimately it was part of your journey to growth and healing, um, to share that story. So yeah, wow, and I can't wait for people to read it.
Yeah.
It's what I've read so far. It's brilliant. So I'm sure the rest of it's brilliant as well. Um, so
Mm.
thanks for coming on the show.
Yes. Well, thank you for those kind words. That's very, very nice of you to say. And yeah, just to add one more thing, it's even in my own healing, I have seen how I am the primary beneficiary of my healing, and that, yes, there will be secondary beneficiaries of that, but it's primarily so that I can create space in my own nervous system and for my own healing and growth. And that will spill over into the people around me. And so, yeah, and that's what I hope my book can do is help people figure out in their own lives what sort of toxic environment, even if it's not toxic religion, is there a toxic relationship or some other toxic environment that they can learn from my story and how I got out, how I found my voice, how I processed everything, so that then they can do that for themselves.
Yeah,
Yeah.
fantastic, fantastic. Yeah, where can people find your work and more of what you do?
Yes. Well, so my book is available on Amazon, Bookshop, Barnes and Noble site. And you can also go to my website, nikkipappas.com, and there's a landing page that can connect to all the places where my book is. Then I've got my podcast, Broadening the Narrative, that we talked about before, and people can find me on Instagram at Broadening the Narrative. I have a Facebook group for Broadening the Narrative and Twitter at Broad Narrative.
Yeah, fantastic. Highly recommend following Nikki's work, and get hold of that book. It's available right now. So yeah, go get it. And yeah, you'll be the ones that benefit. So
Mhm.
so yeah, absolutely. Thank you for coming back on the show, and I'm sure we'll have you back again. So yeah, and thanks for listening, everybody.